Welcome to episode 11 of Scattered. Wow, 11. It's been over a year and a half, and we're only at episode 11. You may have noticed that episodes of this podcast are not a regular occurrence. They're released a bit sporadically. I don't know too many full-time podcasters. Everybody seems to do it as an add-on to their already busy lives, and I am no exception. However, I think we may all be able to say that we do our podcast because we have something to say, something that we think others may like to hear. As I outlined in episode 1, I believe awareness and knowledge of scavenged and scattered remains is important. When a person dies or is deposited outside, their remains are likely to be influenced by animals. We need to take into account the effects of the environment upon these remains, including animals. I also believe that people not only need to be aware of this knowledge, but they also need to have access to this knowledge. As such, this podcast is a labor of love for me, a love of research and the complex world of nature, a love of translating complicated knowledge into something more accessible, and a love of the complex problem of scattered remains. How does someone develop a love for these strange and seemingly unrelated things? Sometimes I get asked what brought me to this place, a place where I am deeply interested in research and the complex problem of searching for scattered remains. It's not like I started out with this goal to do this research and disseminate it to the public, but like much of life, things just kind of happened and they led me here. It's been a bit of a journey and not a straightforward one, so I thought I'd put together an episode to show you why I do this podcast, what brought me here, and maybe provide some inspiration or validation to any listener who is, maybe contemplating their own journey and their own goals. So I hope this helps. Welcome to the podcast Scattered, one person's search for the story behind scattered remains. My name is Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical anthropologist and archaeologist. In other words, I like dead people. In this podcast, I speak about the challenges of searching for, discovering, and recovering dispersed remains from outdoor contexts. I offer new perspectives and insights directly from the mouths of researchers, as well as experiences of people who search for remains. All of this aims to provide you with valuable and accessible information on a subject that isn't talked about, doesn't seem to be a priority, and that is very understudied. I hope you enjoy. Recently, I've been asked by different groups to speak to my experiences of academia and of applying my anthropology education in a life outside of academia. When these requests came to me, it seemed the universe was giving me a hint. People were interested in how a university education can be applied to situations outside of academia, whether that education was a BA in arts, an MSc in biology, or a PhD in anthropology. How the heck does anyone make the transition from academia and being a student to being successful in the real world? If you think this is frivolous or a non-issue, I ask you to reconsider. This is the plight of many young people now. Graduates have a university education but are unable to find work. Employers don't understand the value of that university education, and graduates don't know how to translate their education into something useful for prospective employers. Not only have I been through this experience, I see it every day in my work life. I have worked as a research administrator in post-secondary education for over 10 years now. I work with students and academics. I see students trying to position themselves for graduation and employment. I have also seen academics who have spent their entire lives in academia trying to collaborate with those outside of academia or trying to get the results heard by the general public. Both situations present a similar issue. Someone being inside one group and trying to enter or form a relationship with another group. Transitioning or communicating with another group is not only an issue, it is a common issue experienced by nearly every human culture throughout time. As such, it's an issue studied by anthropologists. To refresh your memory or to enlighten those new to this podcast, anthropology is the study of man. Anthros is man, and ology is the study of, so anthropology is the study of man. Or in politically correct terms, it's the study of humans. This is a broad-ranging discipline from culture and language to genetics and human evolution, from the deep, deep past to the current day. As an anthropologist, part of my studies focused on cultures and how they interact with each other. What's an example of this? Well, think of any time trade is attempted between nations or cultures. Not only are there likely differences in languages spoken, but also differences in societal mores and the way business is conducted. Trade negotiations between nations isn't just about money. Culture differences can play a huge part in finding a way to engage with each other. Not only have I studied this issue as an anthropologist, I went through it. I wanted to transition from my role as a student to a role as an employee, from being within the academic environment to being in the non-academic environment. I needed to transition from one group to another. I needed the other group to see me as valuable, to welcome me in. The study of anthropology is filled with case studies of people from one group attempting to communicate, trade, or live with other groups. These case studies include terrifying examples of those who attempted transition only to be exiled from both groups or even to be killed. But there are also examples of successes, people or entire groups that were welcomed into new groups with open arms. If you want to see an example of this, watch the first season of the series, The Outlander. If you haven't seen it, Claire is a nurse in 1940s England. Through magical means, she is transported back to 18th century Scotland. She must transition successfully to a new group and the new culture, lest she be killed or left to die. After my time as a consulting archaeologist, I was looking to switch careers. But I was having a really tough time finding employment outside of archaeology. Employers don't know what anthropology is. People in general don't know what the heck anthropology is. To make matters worse, I had a whole whack of time as a consulting archaeologist on my resume. What can an archaeologist do outside of archaeology? Well, kind of like Claire, I was in that zone between groups. I was exiting one group, archaeology, and looking to enter into another. How? How does somebody do that? Well, I needed to find a way to translate my anthropology education and archaeology experience into something that employers would see as attractive and useful. I needed employers to welcome me in with open arms. In the Outlander series, Claire transitions to a new group by demonstrating her medical skills and ability to apply her knowledge of herbs. In 18th century Scotland, it's a very hazardous place, full of battles and sickness. Claire needed to translate her skills into terms the 18th century Scots would understand so that they could see her value and welcome her into their group. I transitioned to a new group by demonstrating my communication, project management, and out-of-the-box thinking skills. These were skills I developed during my education, then further refined during my archaeology experience. And these were skills that just about any employer could use. Research administration valued my skills and welcomed me in. Because I'd spent a lot of time doing and studying, translating and transitioning knowledge from one group to another, I developed a love of translating concepts into something other groups could understand. I could use this skill every day in my job, and now I'm using it with this podcast. I'm translating knowledge regarding scavenged and scattered remains into something that is hopefully accessible and interesting to you, dear listener. So this podcast is a labor of my love for translating concepts and communicating across groups, which I learned as an anthropologist and as someone who has made a successful transition between groups. As for my love for scattered remains, nature, and research, well, that goes back a little further. I was born in rural Alberta. I was a country kid who roamed the outskirts of a small town by weekday and the Rocky Mountains by weekend. As a Gen X country kid, I was free to wander aimlessly and unsupervised, letting my imagination and curiosity roam and ignite where it may. I was always entranced by nature. I loved observing what happened around me, attempting to discern why something happened, and the series of events that would combine to form the appearance of a tree, a road, or even a house. What was the interconnection of plants and animals and humans? Why did some things work together, but others didn't? How did I fit into all of this? My dad was a carpenter. He made furniture, kitchen cabinets, did home renovations, and built 2 of our houses. He was the one that gave me insight into the act of creation, the series of events from inspiration to design to construction that made the intangible tangible. Woodworking also taught me that there is a specific series of events that needs to occur for the creation to work. You need to do A and B and C before you can do D in order to get E. There's no way around it. You got to do it in that order. I was also amazed by the human body. It was a complex yet self-sufficient system. Here was this organic machine that didn't need to latch onto another organism like lichen or moss to a tree. It didn't need to live in water. It could find food and feed itself instead of waiting for food to drift into its mouth. But most of all, it was extraordinarily complex, yet all of its parts, the heart, the lungs, the cells, the blood, the brain, and the nerves, they all worked together. And all of these things work together to do amazing things like running, talking, dancing, smiling, and playing. I remember in grade 3, I was probably about 8 years old, standing by the school and looking out across the playground. Kids were running and playing. "Isn't the human body amazing?" I said out loud. My friend who was standing beside me looked to the kids playing and said, "Nah, not really." I was shocked. I was shocked that she would say such a thing and shocked that she wouldn't see it because to me, it was obvious the miracle of the human body. Well, any body really, but it showed me that I saw things that others didn't. The human body was a complex, magical thing functioning within a complex, magical environment, and I wanted to know more. Fast forward 15 years or so, and I discovered physical anthropology, or what is commonly termed now biological anthropology. I was captivated by this subdiscipline of anthropology through a course in human evolution. Here was a magical combination of a series of events that led to a creation, which is the modern human body. It was a big, complex puzzle in which a lot of pieces were missing, but that was okay. We were encouraged to fill in the blanks by postulating based on evidence. Anthropology was filled with theories that were modified or discarded as new evidence was discovered. To me, finding physical anthropology was akin to the clouds parting and the angels singing. It was a call that sang to my soul. I drank up everything about human evolution, from the appearance of bipedalism in our ancestors to sexual dimorphism and the environmental context of early hominids. Deciphering the environmental context of early hominids started me down a path of taphonomy. Not just how did the environment influence human evolution, but also how the environment influenced what remains we were able to find from those ancestors. Not all remains survived those millions of years. Why? What happened to cause those remains to disappear when others were found? I browsed the library stacks, sifting through scientific journals and reading anything I could get my hands on about human evolution. My course papers often had pages of references cited, and my instructors sometimes remarked that I could not have read all that material that I cited. Well, I did. Really, I did. At that time, the University of Calgary had both a Department of Anthropology and a Department of Archaeology. I did a degree in each, as physical anthropology was a specialization that was offered to the Department of Archaeology. And because I ended up with 2 undergrad degrees, I likely received the broadest educational foundation possible in the discipline. The alchemy of my undergrad education and my past experience and my childhood brought together my love of the human body, learning, and seeing connections between disparate details. My graduate work was the catalyst that started me on the path of scattered remains research. My graduate supervisor, Dr. Owen Beattie, who is now retired, was the appointed forensic anthropologist for Northern Alberta and the Territories, and he worked directly with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Alberta. He had direct experience working on case files with scattered and scavenged human remains, and as such, the investigation of scavenging upon carcasses was an idea that he posed to me. Even before finishing my first summer of data collection, I knew I was onto something big. Hardly anyone was doing research on scattered remains, yet everyone in law enforcement was asking the question, where do the remains go? I was doing my very own original research that could be applied to real questions. I found this immensely satisfying and fascinating. I wasn't just regurgitating old knowledge and comparing it to other old knowledge. I was creating knowledge. And I was creating knowledge that was useful in real life. Even better, I was outside observing nature. I was back in the elements of my childhood. By the time I graduated, I knew that the research I'd done could be repeated endlessly the world over, and the same results would not be obtained. The research I'd begun was that complex. The permutations were endless. But because this research was so complex, that was the reason it needed to be done. The case of Sandra Levy occurred while I was doing my graduate research, and it hit home how very much this research needed to be done. I kept thinking that those searchers should have found Sandra's remains during the first search, and that their family should have had closure sooner. With the application of scattered remains research to their search efforts, I'm convinced there would have been a quicker resolution to that case. I had been bitten by the scattered remains research bug big time. Since graduating from my master's program in 2004, my research on scattered remains was put on the back burner. Life kind of took over. I needed a job, and I needed to pay my student loans. So I became a full-time consulting archaeologist and attempted to use my education in a non-academic context. In some respects, it worked. However, I was still living much like a student. I was impoverished and debt-ridden, but I also had the added bonus of working up to 100 hours per week in field season. I had no life outside of work, and I also had growing health issues. I needed to reassess and get a life I enjoy. So the first step was, I needed to clean house. Seeing my dad try to live off the very meager income from the Canada Pension Plan opened my eyes. I could easily see myself trying to do the same thing, yet also trying to pay my student loans. That was no way to live. So I needed to cut myself some slack and get a clean slate. I filed for bankruptcy in 2014, and I got a job in research administration. The next step was to try to find out what I enjoyed and bring that back into my life. Research and research on scattered remains were things that fueled whatever fire I had left inside. I wanted, or rather I needed, to reignite my research. I tried to find a PhD supervisor in Canada, but that kind of fizzled out. Nothing was really working. So this caused me to wonder, could I do my research outside of academia? Then my dad died. Just as he did throughout his life, in his death, my dad taught me valuable things. I saw dreams he had left undone, and it broke my heart. I didn't want that to happen to me. And so I thought, maybe I could do my research outside of academia, and I really started to look into that. Then something very serendipitous happened. Just before the pandemic lockdown in March 2020, the RCMP invited me to advise on a cold case. I sat with my colleague Pam Karai in a room full of tall, middle-aged white men dressed in suits around a very large conference table. A case was presented. This case likely involved scavenged and scattered remains, but we weren't sure. We each took turns giving our opinions and perspectives on the salient points of the case. Toward the end of the meeting, something remarkable happened. An RCMP member asked me how far into the ground they should consider digging when they're searching for the remains. I said they shouldn't. He was kind of perplexed. I said that if the person wasn't buried by the bad guy, then there was no cause to believe the remains would be buried. Well, what about leaf litter, he asked. Well, those are just leaves, I said. It's only been 6 years. There won't be that much accumulated in the forest. Well, how quickly does it accumulate? Not quickly, I said. In Alberta, in the boreal forest, archaeologists usually find pre-contact artifacts within the first 30 centimeters below surface. It's very shallow. You can read about it in any archaeological report filed with the province. But he shook his head. That's why we're asking you, Yvonne. I was dumbfounded. Here was something that was so second nature to me, it was first nature, and he didn't know it. I spent my childhood in the forest, playing and digging around. Then I was a consulting archaeologist, spending my time digging around in the forest. Didn't everyone know that artifact deposition in the boreal forest was shallow? Apparently not. Everything that I had spent my whole life taking for granted was, in that moment, shifted into a new light. Yvonne, not everyone knows this. That's when I decided that I needed to combine my loves of translating knowledge, research, and scattered remains research. I developed this podcast so that I could start to excavate the knowledge I'd taken for granted into a form that may help others. And it's not just my knowledge. It's knowledge of others that I think nothing of, like calling upon wildlife biologists to ask about scavenging behavior. This is a no-brainer to me. Of course, I'm going to follow up with somebody who knows all about wild animals. But for others, knowing to ask a wildlife biologist what scavengers are in the area and what animals may have interacted with the remains is knowledge that is far off their radar. This podcast is continuing to be a lesson for me. It's showing me what others don't know and what I take for granted. What might you know that others don't? What do you take for granted that others are clueless about? It's difficult to answer these questions because we live inside our own worlds. It's the ultimate act of knowledge hoarding, and we don't even know we're doing it. I encourage you to dig into this. Find out what you know intimately that for others is the unknown. Then go make your own podcast or YouTube channel. Get that knowledge out there, spread it around, and make it useful. So there you go. That's a bit about my own journey, how I got into researching scattered remains and why I continue to do it. While I didn't start out aiming to get to where I am now, I'm glad I'm here. I do things I love with people I like and appreciate, and I feel empowered with where I am in life. I wish the same for you. Before I leave, I'd like to let you know about a couple of videos I made for our research sites from last year. These videos show how the remains of pig carcasses at each site have scattered since we deposited them on August 4th, 2021. It's neat to see what's left, what the bones look like, and to where they were scattered. Check it out on my website at yvonnechurlin.com. And if you want to get a bit of a taste of what consulting archaeology is like in Canada, you might want to check out my book, Memoirs of a Reluctant Archaeologist, available in print on Amazon and as an ebook at most major sellers. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please leave a rating or review and share this episode and podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues.